Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Joshua Lisec, who is a ghostwriter and an author in his own right. He's penned such books as The Unhumans with Jack Posobiec and Bulletproof, also with the same co-author, and his latest book is So Good They Call You Fake. In this conversation, we talk about his ghostwriting and how he went from being kind of a moderate liberal to a right-wing, not quite pundit, but thinker. And in that change, we talk about the landscape of the so-called online right and how that's spilling over into the real world, especially in the big tent Trump circus. You can find links to his work down there in the description, as well as links to support this channel. Without further ado, here is Joshua Lisec. So, writing.
Yes.
How do you get it done? What's the trick?
I have said for a number of years that while writer's block is real, ghostwriter's block is not. And that's because from the get-go, we are given a job to be done. So it's not simply write this book, Joshua. It is, I want to write this book, Joshua, so that I can send it to potential clients in this particular industry. They'll take a look at the cover, skim the table of contents, read the back, just flip to a random chapter, and they go, oh my God, this guy knows exactly what he's talking about. We need to get him in here and solve our problems. And that can be sent to an executive, it could be sent to a founder, it could be sent to potential clients, from dentists to divorce lawyers. I have worked with both and everything in between. And when the objective is known, that you want a reader to become a customer or become a high dollar value client in the States, let's say, then the book you must write then becomes something like a long form sales letter for the client's services. But it must not feel like a brochure. It must contain actual value. And therefore you must know what that type of prospect or customer or clientele in that particular market or niche are looking for. And then you write the book that slowly and hypnotically yet succinctly answers all their questions. And the people who are fit for this book's author's business can easily find their way to becoming clients from that point.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of that Liam Neeson quote from, was it Taken? I have a particular set of skills, kind of thing. You'd bill yourself as the ghostwriter of the right. Is that because you are particularly keen on those ideas or adept at those ideas? What's your background as a thinker?
A bit of both, actually. It was following Donald Trump's surprise victory in 2016, going in 2017, where it became safe for, let's say, right-wing authors to share new right type of ideas in the form of books. And so there were a number of politicians and entrepreneurs who had either Googled ghostwriter or they had asked through the grapevine who a good ghostwriter is. And I came up several times. Now, at that time, I was still kind of in my, I like to joke, NPR American phase. There's a little hyphen in there. The NPR Americans are those people who believe official sources and think that they are now informed and they know everything. And that was me at that time. But because I grew up in a conservative Christian environment, I did not look down on MAGA, let's say, or Republicans or conservatives, even though I had kind of pendulum swung from one end to the other. And I began to notice something when I began working with right-wing clients, even though I wasn't right-wing. Number one, they were more respectful than my left-wing and liberal clients. They paid their bills on time. They treated me like an equal or like a peer or like a trusted advisor and a consultant, not like a peon, a subcontractor, freelancer, or servant, like I noticed my left-wing clients were doing. And it was the left-wing clients whose messages were all about diversity and inclusion and just be a good effing person. And they were not exactly good effing people whatsoever, as I had a purview into their private lives. And they had a tendency to be cruel. And all the things they said MAGA was, they were. And I saw this up close and personal. And then I realized, in order to attract who I want to work with, which are respectful, a clientele who pay on time, I must repel. And so I decided in 2017, 2018-ish that I would begin marketing myself as a person with these ideas that would resonate with the right. And it sort of picked up more and more and more and more. And
Hmm.
I began working with more and more and more characters and influencers on the right, both in the kind of the old school conservative world and also in the sort of new right influencer sphere. And I've now authored and co-authored books in that specific space myself, which of course is a form of marketing my ghostwriting services
Oh yeah,
because I
for sure.
practice what I preach.
Yeah. What are some of those ideas that you floated?
Probably one of the most important ones that has taken on is this idea that calling hypocrisy on the left doesn't work because they're not playing a positive sum game. In a winner take all system, which is our two-party system, you can't be nice and kind and forgiving and let's be bipartisan and just get along. If one side says let's be bipartisan and the other side says let's win every time at any cost, who's going to win most of those games? And what the right had previously, we'll say old school conservatives and Republicans, the sort of environment and around the sort of politicians that I grew up with and around, and even meeting through some of the homeschool conventions and whatnot that I did as a youngster and as a teenager and young man, there is a sense of we take the high road and we put principles before power. And even if we lose, we can know that we did the right thing and we played by all the rules. And then we realize that the left doesn't play by any rules. They make us play by their rules, and they have their own set of rules. And they have a friend-enemy distinction, which goes back to a policy under Lenin and then Stalin, and of course the famous left-wing government that was the Soviet Union, that
Hmm.
you were either with us or you were against us. And if you were with us, then you could be forgiven of any crime that you've committed. And if you're against us, then, as that famous Soviet saying goes, show me the man and I'll show you the crime. And of
Hmm.
course, we have seen over the last several years a radical left wing movement further to the left that mimics many of the techniques, tactics, tools, and tricks of communist revolutions in the past. And so that, of course, ultimately became a book that I authored alongside Jack Posobiec last year that was it was well, number one, it was the best-selling book of the summer, and it was perfectly timed because it was right in the middle of this presidential election. And one of the things we predicted that we would be seeing, given that we were going, our hypothesis is that we're in the United States over the last 60 years, we have been going through a slow walked, irregular communist revolution in this country. And we make our arguments for that and demonstrate why that's the case. And we point out that if our hypothesis is correct, you would expect to see high profile assassinations, attempted assassinations in the present day. And it was 6 days later that Donald J. Trump was shot in the head there in Butler, Pennsylvania. And then we wrote the book about that, which now is more detailed than anything that any of the Senate or House subcommittees have released on the matter. The book that we wrote in 3.5 weeks leading up to the election, called Bulletproof, that book is more complete than anything from the federal government, which is kind of
Hmm.
hilarious that two guys from the Midwest can pull that off.
Yeah.
But don't bet against Lisec and Posobiec, eh?
Well, rather, or beyond history rhyming, why assassinations? What's the essence of that?
The objective from a left-wing perspective is because their philosophies generally are based first and foremost on envy and resentment. To get a little bit religious and spiritual, the left-wing ethos seems to descend, and I'm going to speak religiously and mythologically for a moment, from a Luciferian pride. What you have, I should have. That's not fair. So I'm going to lead a rebellion to take it. That, of course, is one of the oldest stories of humanity, and the fall of the fallen angels and Lucifer,
Cain.
Satan, and the snake, and all those various stories from Christian history and Christian mythology with a capital M. I would respectfully put that there. And every left wing movement that we have seen, whether it's a violent uprising or it's left wing culture, it is we must destroy that which has been built before us. We must uglify that which is beautiful. We must take from those who are productive and give to those who are not productive. We must make life difficult for the law-abiding and make life easier for those who are lawbreakers. We must take the majority and make them prisoners of the minority. We must tear down, steal, kill, and destroy, which of course is what Jesus says of the enemy he's speaking about there in the Gospels. And so we see a spiritual and even a religious, you could say subtext or substrate or even foundation within all left-wing movements. And what we did in the book Unhumans is it's an extension of a documentary I executive produced a number of years ago that asked the question, following the election of Donald J. Trump, why is it okay for there to be so much violence against Trump supporters? And why is it funny? And of course, there are a number of viral clips of journalists, politicians, and pop culture entertainers laughing at Trump supporters in 2015, 2016, 2017 being assaulted and even multiple of them being murdered. And how that was haha funny because they're Trump supporters. It's okay. They're subhuman, right? That was the subtext within popular culture at the time. And even though I was identified as liberal at that time, 2015, 2016, 2017, I thought, wait a second. These are the people that are saying they're the good guys. And they're the ones justifying violence against everyday average people, kidnapping, murder, and it's okay because they're conservatives, because they voted for Donald J. Trump. That doesn't sound right. How could we have the moral authority if that's us? Why, and why is no one talking about the problem of left-wing violence? We're sort of inventing this boogeyman of right-wing violence, which doesn't really exist to the extent that left-wing violence has throughout history. And so that question...
You can point to individuals, and they're usually thoroughly prosecuted for their crimes. You can point to individual right-wing or right-coded violent actions, but they're usually discrete individuals that are thoroughly prosecuted to the extent of the law.
Yes, and even beyond the extent of the law, as we saw from the January 6th protesters, the vast majority of whom were peaceful protesters, unaware of the fact that they were breaking and entering or they were trespassing or whatever the claims were made against them. Many were prosecuted like they were domestic terrorists. And what we've also observed over the last several years, and even decades, is, like as you say, the right-wing coded, anarchist, libertarian, ANCAP type of people. In many cases, there's someone who is within the federal government who is egging them on. Like with the Governor Whitmer kidnapping plot. It turned out that something like at least half or the majority of the co-conspirators were actually informants or federal agents or something like that. And that's what we regularly see. It's like the supply of right-wing violence is far below the demand from the media and the Democrats for right-wing violence. Whereas we have the exact opposite problem on the left. And I noticed this at that time being very much a left-wing, identified with the left, and then realized, like that famous meme, are we the baddies? And that question became my film. It was directed by a Canadian filmmaker named Kurt Jamongel. It released in 2021. And all of the various, you would say, intellectual dark web characters who were sort of like, wait a second, I'm a liberal, and these crazy leftists who are attacking Trump supporters, they don't represent me. What happened to Democrats? We went crazy. And that was sort of the intellectual dark web. And so a number of those voices and characters either endorsed the film or were in the film or gave interviews about the film, and it was a fun time. But of course, we talked about communist revolutions throughout history and the patterns that they follow. But we specifically drew from some of that material for the book Unhumans, which of course is a verb. And what we realized is left-wing movements throughout history, they tend to do an undoing of the let's say classical human rights to life, liberty, and property, but they go in reverse order because that's easiest and they get the least resistance when they go that way. So they begin to fringe on property rights. They'll do things like land reform and property taxes that target one demographic or group over another, or one class or profession over another. In the name of fairness, they will rile up mobs of peasants or ex-convicts. They will release from prison early those people who are otherwise violent offenders and begin inflicting them upon the people so that their property is endangered. And they can create a greater divide between the poor and the rich, and they can decrease the number of kulaks or middle class, as we would say today, from the Russian. Those are sort of like the small business owners and small time landowners and middle class of the first Russian and then Soviet period. And those are the ones who are most viciously targeted. So you have the elites who are within the party or within the movement who are doing everything they can to decrease the size of the kulaks, the middle class, the small business owners, while increasing the number of malcontents and troublemakers who can then do the bidding of the elites and then have them run amok throughout society. And you have that reversal, the elimination of rights to life, liberty, and property, but in the reverse order. So once the property rights begin to get infringed, then they get to move on to one's civil rights and one's human rights at that point. Freedom of speech, for example, gun rights, so on and so forth. Civil liberties, and then ultimately they get to taking your life from you in one way or another via unlawful imprisonment or something like that. And we made what many have considered to be the best arguments for the hypothesis that we have in the United States been witnessing an irregular communist revolution for the last 60 years. And it is a low intensity conflict, much in the same way that warfare has changed from battlefields and hot warfare for the most part, barring Ukraine and Russia. It's been these institution infiltration efforts. It's been targeted violence, and it's been culture clashes and culture war and cultural revolution. We outline all of this in the book, but it very much mapped onto my own experience, going from being right wing when I was young, and then early mid-20s left wing, and then wait a second, these are not the good guys. I can't be a good guy if I'm over here with these people, domestic terrorists, apologists. I mean to go back over here. And when I went back over here, ironically, what sealed the deal for me, and okay, I'm on the right again. I get it now. I get it. It was in, I think it was September or October of 2017. Two of my right-wing politician clients had invited me to a local Republican event, and they said, "Oh, we're at the country club. We're gonna have some guests and some dignitaries and some people here. We're gonna have this guy, this author from downtown, from down the road. He's gonna come and speak." Okay. So I sit next to and I spend the day there. It's like morning through afternoon, early evening. I am sitting next to J.D. Vance at this event. And we're talking books and writing and whatnot. And I'm hearing the ideas. And we're like, yeah, Republicans are a lot different than, George W. Bush and the global war on terror. And of course, he had some experience in that. And we talked books and authorship and how much the right wing has changed. And these aren't the ideas that I grew up around, where it's like foreign wars and low taxes, unless it's taxes that are going to pay for foreign wars. This sort of interventionist, globalist, let's get everything as cheaply as possible, have it all made in China, Republicans, like George Bush the first. And opening up of China and how wonderful that is, you see. And this was very much not the Republicans. And the conversations we're all having at the various tables, and then the remarks that J.D. Vance himself gave, back when he was kind of baby face, no beard at that time, he was remarking how the Republican Party had become very much like the Democratic Party that he knew growing up. That these are the working class, overall wearing type of people who call their grandparents Meemaw and Papaw. And that was something specific that he said. And they knew how to fish growing up. And he said when he was a kid growing up in Southern Ohio, where I am also from, and I can vouch for this, those are Democrats back in the 90s. Mm-hmm. But now that's Republicans today. And so and we've seen that switch also with the super healthy focus on physical wellness and nutrition and getting all this crap out of our food and our air and our environment. How that used to be like a big time far left wing set of causes. And now that's people who wear MAGA hats talk about that now. Mm-hmm. And it's a sort of a strange shift where it has become, Republicans, I think, have become the party of populism, which really is what works for the people, what do the people need to prosper and live wonderful lives, versus the party of power. How do we take power and keep power, protect our power at any cost? Right? That, of course, is the Democratic Party. That is the sort of the institution of the left, which, of course, is as anti-democratic as you can possibly get, with the anointing first of Biden in 2020 and sort of the slow-walking pseudo even primary that they had. back in 2020. And then, of course, the switcheroo at the last minute with Kamala Harris, something like 3 months left to go. And she was picked by somebody in the party. Whoever had the president's account at that time, President Biden, is the one who sort of picked Kamala to make her win. So there was no real primary, of course, at that. And that's about as anti-democratic as you can get. Um, all of these various ideas have been sort of percolating below the surface in my personal life and in my work and for my clients. And so it's been a transition to this point where I am now writing about these ideas, both during the day and moonlighting, I guess you might
Yeah.
say. While at the same time, I'm still writing for dentists and divorce lawyers and professionals who want to write a book to get clients. And I do the same thing. I just write about Trump.
Mhm.
That's how I get clients now, you see.
There are and have been percolating on the right these NRX types, Dark Enlightenment,
Hmm.
Machiavellian, at least in their willingness to talk about power. And from the left me centrists,
Yeah.
yesterday's liberals, who who jumped off the woke train, found themselves politically homeless for a time, and then tried to, found a great audience by lending some respectability to critiques on so-called wokeness or progressive overreach. Those people are very wary of this, Yarvanite, monarchist, or these evaluations of power. So it's kind of an interesting tension between what you were talking about. The Democratic Party has become the party of power, and the right, broadly speaking, is right now party of the population. But there are people who are seriously analyzing power. What do you think about that? The Luciferian right, or at least the fear that the IDW set has towards contingents on the right who are willing to talk about race in a not colorblind, hunky-dory 90s end of history manner, for example.
It is my perspective that it does come out of these conversations about power from the right wing perspective do come out of populism. Because when we think about what's actually good for the people, generally speaking, mob rule is not good for the vast majority of normal, everyday people. Mob rule is not. And that has tended to be what democracies trend towards is you get the most highly motivated people who want change, who will often have an extreme viewpoint, and they're able to through coalitions or through voting or through various NGOs or even through electing people or electing judges or electing the people who appoint the judges to get their deeply unpopular opinions power,
Mm-hmm.
even though that's generally not the will of the people. And so the sort of allergy that the right has had to power, from my perspective, and observing this over the past 2 decades or so, since I've been sort of paying attention, what I was initially turned off by, I am now, let's say,
At home with?
excited about, hopeful
Oh,
for. Yes,
excited about. Okay.
yes, which is this idea, wait a second, if you put principles before power, you won't have any power. And what good are your principles? You might, to sort of normie-ize it. There's the meme I would use, which is something like, if your principles brought you to this, of what use were your principles?
Yeah.
And that is where we realize that power has a great point. And some of the characters we talk about in Unhumans were people who had the capacity and the courage to exert significant power over the left wing, murderous, thieving, and in many cases, innumerable instances of sexual assault that were occurring in their countries, done by left wing guerrillas or militias, or just simply liberty mobs running amok, doing whatever they wanted. But because they were sort of client groups of the left wing establishment, they were allowed to do whatever they want. And in the words of Generalissimo Francisco Franco, he said, "Wherever I am, there will be no communism." And in the context of his civil war, I believe we successfully reframed that as a instance of righteous violence and a military uprising to protect the interests of the people of Spain. And of course, there have been descendants who have come forward from that, talking about what Grandpa grew up with during the Civil War when the Republicans came around with their weaponry from the Soviet Union being supplied. And of course, the Soviet Union's influence in stealing the election for the Soviets is another fascinating case study we briefly talk about in that
Hmm.
book. But the fate of a people ought not be left up to chance. Or let's just hope that both sides play nice and play fair. If one side wants principles and the other side wants power, they'll both get what they want. Unfortunately, that means there's not going to be much power over here with the principles. So again, what good are your principles? And so we want to find, from my perspective, a balance for the power with the principles, but we have to seek power. Otherwise, we're not going to have the means to live by our principles. Our principles will become illegal, effectively. That's not going to work. And I notice a sort of tendency for particularly the faction of evangelical Christians on the right to almost fetishize martyrdom and victimhood, where it's like, well, the Bible says the rapture's a coming and bad things going to happen to people like us, and we got to stand firm to the end to be saved. And if a lot of people are persecuting us, we're not really popular. That means Jesus is coming back any day soon. I grew up believing that Jesus was going to come back on Y2K. We just knew it. We watched all the documentaries. It says so right there in the Bible. Then I actually read the Bible. Oh, wait, it doesn't say anything about this rapture stuff at all. Oh, dear.
Pentium processors in the Psalms.
Yeah. Oops. And then you realize that evangelicals were the major influence, spiritual influence during both Iraq wars, and that there was this subtext that if we can drum up violence in the Middle East, we can make Jesus come back sooner. And that's why Israel is our greatest ally. It's this evangelical underpinning that Israel founded in 1948, this secular pro-LGBTQ democracy, so-called. It's a socialist state, is God's chosen people. And that's what Mike Johnson and Ted Cruz and the Huckabees and Bush administration 1 and 2, that's what they actually believe. And I know this because I grew up in that world, and they would always come and speak at the church conferences and the homeschool conventions and whatnot. And we all knew that this was true. And we just knew Jesus was going to come back any day now. And that was 20 years ago, you see. So,
And that was the right 20 years ago.
Yes, that was. And fortunately, those ideas that tend towards, well, bad things happen to us because that's what Jesus said in the Bible. But the problem is that version of Christian nationalism means we need to use the state to make the rapture happen sooner. That sort of Christian nationalism is an evangelical, is driven by evangelicals, let's say. What we seem to observe in the Christian nationalism of the founding fathers is something like, we are a Christian nation of different kinds of Christianities, and in the old country, we didn't get along. We slaughtered each other over our differences. You were the wrong kind of Protestant. You were the wrong kind of papist. Okay. So let's allow each state to have its own state church. If you like, you can have your own state religion, but we're not going to have a national religion. So the Christian nationalism of that time was, we all believe in Jesus or God or something, but we're not going to try to force one state or population to have this particular denomination as their official religion. And so there were state religions, there were state constitutions, and there were even, of course, church services held on government property, both federal and state, in the early days of the United States of America, because this is a Christian, or was a Christian nation. And there's a sort of, I think, fear that is being drummed up by the IDW space, that Christian nationalism means something like I don't know. I have a hard time actually getting out of these people who have criticized me personally as well, and I'm blocked by many of these characters. I've tried to ask them, what is it you think I believe? You call me a Christian, you call me a Christo-fascist. I get that one from time to time. What do you think I believe that you don't believe? And then that's, oh, your Mott and Bailey tactic. That's a straw man. Blocked. Okay, well, what is it? So I am still trying to, Benjamin, tease out from these characters, what is it they believe I believe? And then they'll post something from Curtis Yarvin that seems pro-monarchy and anti-democracy. And I didn't write that, but he makes the point about the power of a chief executive. and how it's the greatest companies in the world now are run by a small group of people, an oligopoly, or it's one person. Steve Jobs is a modern day king, for example. Mark Zuckerberg, modern day king. Elon Musk, modern day king in their business domains. And you're not going to have Apple built by a democracy. That seems to be the argument that Curtis and others are making. That's my sort of clumsy interpretation of it. But I don't see, for example, how we would turn a constitutional republic like the United States into a monarchy, or how that would even work to benefit the people. And that's what my own starting point is. I say my own personal political philosophy I like to call middle class nationalism. Middle class nationalism, which is how do we make it so that as many Americans as possible can enter into and remain in the middle class, being defined as you can afford to take your family on a nice family vacation. Your wife doesn't have to work. She can stay home with the kids. So you're able to take your family of 2+ kids out on vacation, go to a nice restaurant, order from the menu without having to worry about prices while you're there. That is middle class nationalism. How can we make as many people, many families, and there's a number of things that are a part and parcel with this, like homeownership, like new marriages, like the fertility rate, and all of those things that create that American dream. Not to go back to the 50s because we don't live in that same economy in that same time, but the modern day version of that. How can we, as a nation and as a system of systems, enable as many people to experience that as possible, and then maintain that lifestyle? And if that's what the vision is, and that's my vision for the country, then what tools do we have at our disposal to help that happen for as many people as possible? Is it democracy? Is it monarchy? I don't think either of those in their purest grade A form is going to get the job done, right? The most recent version of a direct democracy we witnessed was the storming of the Bastille and the murder of 30,000 people with the guillotine in 1789. That was a true democracy, majority rules mindset. And then we have a constitutional monarchy like the United Kingdom. Well, they can't even prevent frankly, a migrant invasion and parts of the country being no-go zones for us people of lighter color. So what purpose was that? If your constitutional monarchy brought you to this, of what use was your constitutional monarchy? So my vision is that middle-class nationalist anecdote episode of the family, the dad with the one income, able to provide this nice vacation meal for his wife and kids, and not have to worry about the prices on the menu. How do we create that America for as many people as possible and keep it? That's the vision. And for better or worse, right now, the Republican Party of the new right is closest in alignment with that, from my perspective. And some people on the new right, what do you call them? Some are called brutal Americans or the barbarian right. I think some of those ideas will probably be helpful to create that. Others probably not so much, and are based on maybe some resentment towards not having access to that. Certainly, the far left has resentment for not being that. But you're going to get Donald Trump and the MAGA people, or you're going to get Luigi Mangione. And now you get MAGA or Mangione. Next generation, take your pick. You've got violence and bloodshed in the streets, or you've got populist candidates, and those are really your two choices now, folks.
What you were saying about the middle class nationalism, you described it in economic terms, but there's a core, when you go to the root of economy, it means the home.
Yes.
There's got to be a moral framework. Can you describe that in either mythological or aesthetic terms? Like we can't go back to the 50s, you said, but there's got to be these images that we already have and have had in our past of what that looks like, what the moral bearing. And it sounds kind of Christian in a particular way.
Yes, I think
so. From a particular time, not crusading Christian and not a first century Christian, but there's a Christian American kind of thing. And you see it with the Mormons are phenomenally successful. And it seems like they are embodying this middle class nationalism.
Yes, we do. We do see this with a number of Christian denominations. We see this with at least and both like across populations and also anecdotally in my own life with I'll say Christianities because they're distinct from one another, and there's a number of different denominations that are so different they're basically not even the same religion if we're to call it all Christianity. But the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, that Christianity, the various ethnic Orthodox Christianities like the Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox here in America, and then the various Catholic faiths, those families of those three Christianities, it seems like they're their training up of roles and duty for those roles. That seems to
Hmm.
be that sort of that moral bearing and perhaps that direction for how are you to live your life.
Hmm.
And they're given images from a young age of one day you will grow up and have children, you will be a husband and father, Johnny. And so they're taught from a young age to see themselves as someone who becomes someone versus someone who is a pleasure seeker or simply is out to get a job, you know. And girls from these three religions, they're given images of industrious mothers and wives who make the most of what they're given. They're maybe not working out in the career force if they go or out in the career world and in the workforce. If they do have a career, it's sort of like in support of or alongside of their other roles in life. And it's an aspiration. Like these children aspire to be fathers one day. They aspire to be mothers one day. They aspire to be married and have families and go on family vacations. And in a in a number of cases, the kids growing up in these environments have positive examples of that. Like they love their own childhood, that they want to recreate that and have their own kids to recreate that with, you
Hmm.
see. And it used to be that Christianities across America taught similar, let's say, role duty, where it is your duty to become a father one day and carry on the family lineage, and the family means something. And there was a time, I think the 50s are thought of fondly because of the monoculture and the Christianities that everyone was familiar with at that time. It was, I don't know that it was necessarily explicitly Protestant Christianity that was sort of the dominant strain at that time. It was the Christian vehicle which brought to people that sense of this is your role, this is your duty. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a wife? And the sexual liberation, sexual revolution, and all of the various laws that changed after that, following the culture shifts, brought us to a point where you can be anything you want, you can do anything you want. You know, first wave feminism was women ought to have the same civil rights that men do when it comes to voting and property, for example, and being able to testify in court. And fourth wave feminism has become there's no such thing as men and women. Women can become men and men can become women. There's no such thing as gender. It's a social construct. And you know, pink is blue and blue is pink and all these things. So it's a complete elimination of order. It's like disorder maxing.
Hmm.
And when we know what the job is to be done, we are more so able to orient ourselves towards that. So if I'm a child growing up and I believe that it's my duty and my privilege to one day become a husband and father and provider for my family, and that message is reinforced and I see positive examples of that, then I'm going to dream about that. I'm going to aspire to that and I'm going to long for that and becoming those things and doing those things. And I'm going to orient my own work and career and time that I have as a young person to go in that direction. And the monoculture that provided that to each of our families is in fact long gone. And so middle class nationalism does involve a sense of resurrecting that monoculture for us. And I think there are aspects of the barbarian right, they would call them, new right, online right, dissident right, whatever they want to go by. The Yarvin right, I don't know. Doesn't matter. There are
There's
probably
many
some great
rights,
ideas.
as many rights as there are Christianities, nearly.
Yes, yes. You probably saw that illustration of the fact that the various left-wing ideas are all clustered together, whereas right-wing ideas are kind of all over the place, and there's more diversity of ideas on the right than on the left. There's a greater difference between one conservative and another than there are amongst any of the liberals, which is quite funny.
Hmm.
The true
Yeah.
diversity of ideas is on the right. And I think that's good because if we have this vision, which I will describe as the middle class nationalism, how do we create that? The more ideas we can put on the table to help create that, then that's where we're going to go. And so I try to use I would call it biblical tent making, which is a reference to the New Testament in the book of Acts, where the various apostles and disciples, they would fund their missions work by making tents. And that's what Peter and some of the others did. And so, politically speaking, metaphorically speaking, I liken my ghostwriting business to that, where the vision that I have, which is I would say it is as broad as the United States is, that this middle class image, this anecdote, this episode that I have laid out, this is what I want for as many people as possible. So I will make my tents while I talk about this. And sometimes I'll get a tent which has it emblazoned on the side,
Yeah.
this particular message. Meaning sometimes I'll do books that help advance this message and can sell tens of thousands of copies and wake people up and be read by members of the administration and other elected officials. And other times I'm going to be writing about dentistry or divorce, for example, or anything and everything in between.
There's always a tension in what we're speaking about, between power and principle, between monoculture and diversity of thought. So you're agitating for a monoculture in which it's a big tent monoculture, and people who are worried. Well, I think there's a meme going around about leaving the Nazi bar, or there's another kind of joke. If you're at a party and one person's a Nazi, then everybody else is a Nazi.
Oh yes,
right?
it's kind of like it's a story told version of the slippery slope fallacy, effectively.
Yeah, yeah. But it's in the left direction because it never
Yes, I
works
see
that
that.
if you're at a cocktail party with the communist, you're just a good liberal who's speaking cross difference. But there's something about the Nazi or the specter of the Nazi. And so on the right, there is a specter even and deployed by the left me 90s liberals that call themselves classical liberals, this desire to gatekeep and to disparage or to cast a very broad net of deploring who is acceptable, who's not acceptable. And because the loose network of associations on the right overlaps with people who are more or less ethnocentric, more or less not Christo-fascist, but more or less we need an explicit Christianity in order for our country to flourish. It's difficult to describe to ease the worries of those people who see fascism around every corner, even though they were called fascists and booted out
Yes.
of their club. And they're trying to get back to their station on the elite. I don't know exactly. That's kind of psychologizing what's going on there. But I'm just wondering, how do you promulgate the message that it's just constant. It's not hypocritical. It's very nuanced because at once it's monoculture and diversity. At once it's Christian and yet Christianities. And if you talk to any given Christian and get into their faith, they always, in my experience, eventually say that, well, I know what's right. Everybody else is
Yes.
kind of wrong. I'm more right than everybody else. I don't know why being right is a part of faith. I don't understand why those two ideas always come packaged together. But how do you express that even in this stabilized, more homogenous culture that celebrates the norm, that there's not this eradication of the margin, or there's not this tendency towards hatred of difference and that Nazi pathology of seeking purity?
What we observe as a template in the founding documents and those structures, I think, are helpful for guiding us here. Because this idea of a separation of powers and the struggle and the tension within those groups vying for power effectively and the checks and balances on one another, because they're each given power, but it's effectively 2-on-1 at any given point if one tries to have ultimate power. So the fact that there is that within the federal government, that tension, and then with this broad, unofficial adoption of Christianity as effectively the national religion in principle and in practice, but not in policy, and you allow each state's people. So like Maryland, for example, is actually pronounced Maryland. That's where the Roman Catholics were. Okay, so if you want to be a Catholic American in the early days of the country, you go to Maryland. Okay, you want to be this denomination, you go to Massachusetts. That denomination, you go to Rhode Island. That denomination, and so you allowed to have, and I know it's a very unpopular word to use, but I'll use it anyway. You have a confederation of various peoples within the same system because there's enough that they agree about that they can engage in mutually beneficial reciprocity. We'll work together, help each other out, but you and I are different. So the differences are acknowledged. And it's not a sort of forced diversity where let's all get along and pretend that Catholics and Protestants who have Scottish versus Irish ancestry, that's going to go well. Probably won't go well if they're forced in the same area. I think it was in the 1970s there were erected in Northern and not literally Northern Ireland, but the northern part of the Republic of Ireland. I think they called them peace walls. And they were effectively giant barriers between the neighborhoods of the Protestant Irish and the Catholic Irish. And I think they called them, maybe it was peace fences or peace walls or something like that. These giant walls around the neighborhood. But they're Irish and they're able to effectively share enough of the space that they can get along. But the idea was that in our mammalian brain, we are tribal. The neocortex is able to reflect upon that with this grand gift of consciousness and realize that sometimes goes very poorly for me and my family, my offspring, my genes, that bitter tribalism. It's better if I can collaborate with other members of the tribe and even other tribes at a tribal level, so long as we're able to make this work. And that seems to be much of the history of the European experiment, of that going well or that going very poorly. And so the tribes can either get along post-Westphalia, the Treaty of Westphalia, or they can't, and there are wars of religion and ethnicity and so on. So I think there needs to be that perpetual tension where if you look at, again, that illustration, the right is over here, but the ideas are all over the place. And I think that allows for such a great range of potentially useful ideas that are abnormal or that are outside of what one would expect. And that's where you can find new ideas, useful ideas, and creativity even. And different aspects are not off limits that are off limits when you're in kind of the closeted thinking of the leftover here in your tiny little nutshell versus an ocean of potential ideas here. And it is natural for each, let's say, micro tribe to want to dictate terms for everyone else. But I think the best system design for the American experience is to allow for the other micro tribes to say, no, we're not doing it that way. And it is sort of a perpetual tension. The people of Maryland probably wanted the entire nation to be Catholic, and the rest said, no, we're not doing that. And so, okay, the Catholics can go over there in Maryland and be happy. What about the Church of Christ? What about the Episcopals? What about the Anglicans? What about the this and the that and the Baptists and the Unibaptists and the Anabaptists and okay, and then it starts to get crazy. The German Baptists, the Dutch Baptists, and you have 33,000 different Christian denominations, right? And I think there is a natural, I'm right, so you should do things my way. And when you add the tribal aspects to it, it doesn't work. But now the question I think you brought up, Benjamin, is what do we do about this? Probably the best guiding principle is something like, to whom do we have the highest duty? For whom are we most responsible in this? Children. Our children, the children of our town, our city, our county, our state, our country. Because they can't decide for themselves. They will be adults one day, and we are stewarding this land and these systems and these governments and these spaces for the next generation. We have a duty to them. And then if we think, what's in the best interest of the children? Which, by the way, in every domestic dispute or divorce case, that is the primary question the judge is asking. What is in the best interest of the children? So there's a legal basis for that question. And it's always the best interest of the children. And if we are talking about, Christofascism or nationalism or populism or democracy or this, well, what's in the best interest of the children? And then when we get to questions of, let's say, racial violence, and I'm just north of Cincinnati, that's a big topic around here these days. Is it in the best interest of a person of lighter colors, child, to be accosted because of their race, as is happening a lot in this country? Is that in their best interest? Hmm. Is it in the best interest of a child to grow up without a biological mother and a biological father, but with two dads or two moms, and knowingly deprive that child of their biological other parent? Is that in the child's best interest? So that, as a guiding question, become very useful. Is it in the best interest of a child to have them eating food that's filled with artificial synthetic dyes and colors and flavors and fillers that are banned in other countries? But because they taste good, we'll stick them in our food and make it cheaper. Is it the best interest of the child for water and air to have all these chemicals in them? Allow that pollution to happen, so long as they pay a $1 million fine every couple of years and they
Well,
make billions of profits.
if you bring up pollutants in the soil and the water and the air, you also have to think of pollutants in the information streams.
Yes, yes, as well. And there's a lot of them that are, we have to think, wait a second, is that in the best interest of children? And so what we do when we ask these questions, we begin thinking like mature adults. We begin thinking like mothers and fathers. We stop thinking, we sort of like mature in our thinking to the level of ideas versus me first and I want to be in charge and my religion is right. We think what's in the best interest of the children. And we know it's not in the best interest of the children, which is easiest, which is, it's easier to find, by the way. And then we realize that a lot of things in our various environments, be they social or cultural or political or food
Material.
or literal environments, that a lot of this is not in the best interest of the children. So how do we fix that? And then that's where we get our charge effectively. And there's going to be some ideas that are outside the Overton window that allow for that, and others that will be right smack in the middle that feel like centrism almost.
My wife went to a birthday party. Won't tell too much details about it, but it was a ladies' brunch with older women. And they got on to the topic of those Trump supporters, those nasty Trump supporters, assuming that everybody in the room was all on the same page. And why would they not be on the same page? And when you were talking at the beginning of our conversation about the left and its slide towards violence, this communist revolution, the soft war that's going on, or gradual war, it is the case that many people within the title or the demographic of boomer really do think that the Democrat position is the good position. That's the Christian position. That's the most good for the most people, diversity, equity, inclusion. They don't think too far beyond that. They support it. And I was going to ask, well, how do you reach those people? But it kind of seems like those people are going to phase themselves out as the Democratic power kind of continually eats itself alive and either reforms itself towards something more stable or not. The boomers are phasing out. And that boomer mindset, that NPR mindset, I mean, NPR is kind of going tits up, as they say. You know, the cow goes upside down and floats away down the flooded river. I think that's where that phrase comes from, but I'm not sure. So that demographic, that target put aside for the time being, there is another target of the young man, the disaffected young men. And it seems like your work, and I would say propaganda, but I know that that's a contentious term. It's kind of negative, but in the broadest sense, your effort to disseminate your worldview as convincingly and broadly as possible is aimed towards the professional class and towards kind of probably people who are already established, probably in their 40s, 30s, and later 20s if they got the leg up. But there's this agitating class of young men. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on reaching them? What is your attempt to reach them? Do you think that the life will kind of shake out for them? Broadly speaking, they're going to have to make some choices, and a lot of them will end up in the chaff pile, and some of them will be in the germinating pile that actually builds wealth, builds families, builds society, and they'll be your target audience. But do you ever think about reaching out to them? Because that's kind of a hot topic on the right now with this kind of, I don't know much about it and I'm not really interested in it, this war between Tucker Carlson and this young guy named Nick Fuentes, who kind of represents the younger energy, both in his own being and then in his audience. How do you reach those guys?
Throughout history, what we've seen is when there are populations of disaffected young men who can't get laid and can't get jobs, generally unrest follows that particular period of a lot of young men not having access to employment and sex. They can get pretty rough at that point. That's generally why polygamous societies tend not to do well, and they tend to have and face social collapse because a lot of disaffected young men don't got nothing to do. That is a sort of I would say, is a hidden lesson from the War on Terror and the Arab Spring. Is in many of these societies, there's either marriages, plural marriages, multiple marriages, a polygyny, or something close to it, where there's an immense, let's say, hypergamous, which is where the women in the society are marrying up as best they can, and a lot of men are stacking up down at the bottom. And the United States has become a polygamous, a soft polygamous or polygynous society, I would say. We already have sort of seen the onset of soft harems, where that's a successful guy has 5 girlfriends, right? So that leaves 4 dudes without one. That's what polygamy is. And so we're going to see some of, if not many of, similar problems that we generally see in polygamous societies in the United States. I believe personally in the next 10 to 15 years that at a federal level, polygyny will be made legal under the precedent of love is love. And if 2 dudes can marry and 2 women can marry, why can't a man and 2 women? That's not fair. So that's going to be made legal, I believe, and more people are going to be flocking to that. And I suspect it's going to be Gen X, by the way, that does this. It's sort of rebel and like it'll be cool to like have co-wives, and because their kids are all older and grown up, it's not as many considerations there. So that's going to further accelerate the trend, where you're going to have a millennial age guy with 3 Gen Z wives. And I expect it to get rough. A number of people have said something like, Trump is the moderate option. MAGA is the centrist position relative to what these 20-something disaffected single young men are. And it seems like the sort of viewpoints of, yes, Nick Fuentes, but also characters like Andrew and Tristan Tate, where it's about getting money and getting cars and getting girls and having sex with as many of them as possible and like spreading your seed far and wide. What did he say? You're not a man if you only have kids with one woman or something like that, was one of Andrew's most recently viral tweets. And it's sort of like these are men of their times. And it seems like every other keyword out of Nick's mouth is the Jews or something like that. And there generally seems to be a sort of natural position of naming, blaming, and shaming amongst the disaffected young people. And we see this not just on the right, but on the left as well. Luigi Mangione is a folk hero amongst the left, as are other people who've committed violence on the left. Because if I can't buy a house and I can barely afford groceries, which is an apolitical concern, by the way, kids of all backgrounds are having the same problem, particularly in liberal cities. So there's even more disaffected liberal young people in the cities than there are even conservatives in this country. Young people, Gen Z and lower, like basically under 29. And then I think teenagers are Gen Alpha now, right? And kids. And this is the society that they're growing up in. And you've got Luigi Mangione and that sort of neo-Bolshevik type of movement where if we don't get what we want from the system, let's break the system. And we have the reactionary right-wing version of that, which is like Nick Fuentes and the Tates, which is flaunt the law and move abroad and don't pay taxes because that's a scam, and don't be a sucker and don't get married because that's for suckers too. And the whole system's out to get you, and it's the Jews. That's sort of like the Tate Fuentes sphere, let's say, over on the right. And then over on the left is we got to tax the rich and eat the rich, and billionaires should be banned. I think it's that same sort of, we don't have opportunities to get married and have families and have a house, and the sort of the classical American dream. So what I see as problems are indeed very real problems, and the set of solutions that would be in alignment with the middle class nationalism vision I've outlined would give everyone what they want.
Even the Jews? That was a joke.
Even the Jews, yes. Yes. I am personally not a Rapture American, as I like to say, put the hyphen in there. The Rapture Americans are like what I grew up among, which is war in the Middle East. Israel, founded in 1948, is God's chosen people. We got to defend them. We got to fight to the death. We got to spend our blood and money and effort to save Israel, the state of Israel. And people like Nick Fuentes and the Tates and that sort of right-wing sphere are so tired of it. They have the fatigue. And it seems like Israel is, they make Israel a proxy for the Jews. So if it's good for Israel, it's the Jews, they'll say. But there's a lot of Jews here in this country as well who do not benefit from Israel's shenanigans that they have going on there. I think I think of Israel as a vassal state of the United States of America, and it is a mutually beneficial relationship, but it does come with some steep costs to the United States specifically. And they're not our greatest ally. I think by any way, shape, or form, I don't think that's fair. But I'm also not like I'm not anti-Israel. I'm just not pro-Israel. I'm not a fan, you see, like a super fan, like a lot of evangelicals are, who believe that government under Bibi Netanyahu is literally written about in the Bible. And I don't think so.
So what kind of propaganda, or messaging, rather, neutral term, it's not a neutral term. What kind of propaganda is most effective toward shaping specifically under 29-year-old men toward the possibility and then the procedures by which they attain this middle classness? Like, how do you make that? And then actually, how do you capture the imagination of the women, who are promised infinite riches, infinite authority over their authority over their own lives by the liberal world order? They're given utter freedom. It's hard to take that back. It's hard to say motherhood's better than a condo.
We are seeing the tide turn a little bit with pro-motherhood type of influencers, who of course are being utterly and viciously attacked by the left because that's not how it's supposed to work. So the Ballerina Farms company and the family that's behind that, they have all these kids and the stay-at-home mom, and she's like literally the perfect trad wife, and that sort of aesthetic or vibe of the aspirational trad wife, that is moving the needle culturally, because it provides a counter to the boss babe who is exhausted and drinking wine with her cats, whose litter boxes she hasn't scooped, and the house smells terrible because of that. Oh wait, it's not a house because she can't afford that on her income. She has a studio apartment in New York City, and she works 90 hours a week. And she doesn't know the name of the last man she slept with, just some guy from Tinder. Okay? Like that is the reality of I think forthright feminism now. And there's an alternative. It's sort of like a retro alternative. It's like a retro futurist version of motherhood and the digital age and what that can be. And that's now becoming an aspiration. And the magazine, Evie magazine, they get 100 million views a month on their content across social media. They are a cultural powerhouse. And of course, the founders are Catholic. For the men, Catholic and Orthodox, let's say, visuals and rituals are providing, I think, a necessary outlet for frustration, but also, what am I supposed to do with my life? Well, I can live it with virtue. And I can pray the rosary, and I can do the mass, and I can do these things, and I can go to RCA, and I can visit these places, I can go on these pilgrimages. Like, I can do something. Well, I don't have a family. I don't have a house. I can participate in meaning that's greater than myself. And so what we're observing with Gen Z is girls are like trad wife curious Gen Z. And we're seeing with men, they're like Catholic and Orthodox curious. When I go to a Catholic church myself, and there's a strange gap where there's like everybody's a boomer or under 25. And you don't see as many millennials or Gen X, but you see younger people coming up and in looking for purpose and looking for meaning, looking for the transcendent, which generally is what you see in times of in difficult times, as people go to religion. But I think people are going to religion for something different this time, because we're not exactly in abject poverty and there's pestilence and peril and poverty galore. There's a sort of a poverty of the soul and of the spirit, and a lack of prosperity that we were promised as younger generations. Those promises went unfulfilled. Meanwhile, we see baby boomers gallivanting, going on 6-month cruises to Antarctica and Tierra del Fuego. and bragging about it and not spending time with their one grandkid from their three kids that they had, three of whom are still paying off their student loan debts and they have six figures. Oh, and by the way, they've been paying down that balance and they still haven't eaten away at the original number that they owed because the interest payments have kicked in and now they owe twice as much and then been paying already. You see how bad it gets, right?
Yeah.
Like this is the reality that people are facing.
Yeah.
And the alternative to the current malaise of just sort of hedonistic pleasure seeking, that's not fair resentment of the left is something like become the person who earns these things. Build these things yourself. Fashion yourself into the man or purify yourself into the woman who can be these things. And so what we're noticing is women are younger women are gravitating towards like health and wellness and natural living. And I think it's metaphorical also for their spiritual purity, having grown up in a hypersexualized culture. And like, what do you do about that? Oh, you must purify yourself. And so we're seeing that with purifying what they wear in terms of like getting rid of microplastics and wearing natural fibers and animal-based materials instead of this man-made stuff, and taking herbs instead of pharmaceuticals. And that's like a massive coalition within MAGA of the Make America
Mm-hmm.
Healthy Again people that's almost entirely female. Of
Mm-hmm.
like young mothers, older
Yeah.
mothers who have been at this hippie stuff for decades, you know.
Yeah.
They protested Vietnam, and now their great grandkids are voting for Trump, right? That sort of protest to President Trump pipeline is real, and that's a space also that EV Magazine. A lot of their content is on natural living as well, and natural living is a thing for both men and women that there seems to be something for. Like, what is the natural state of a man who's succeeding and thriving? Well, he's lifting weights. That's what men need to be doing. That's our starting point is to become who we must be is
Mm-hmm.
literally lift weights 3, 4 times a week.
Yeah. Eat eggs, lift weights.
Yeah, eat eggs. Yes, eat steak.
Who's been your spiritual mentor in your life? Intellectual, either somebody you've known or your reader that you've read.
I've had a number of different, I would say, voices that have spoken into my life. There hasn't been a one singular, let's say, trusted voice. I've had sort of a, I guess you could say like a team or an informal board of life advisors over the years, and they sort of followed along with where I was in that state. So growing up, of course, it was largely evangelicals, and then when I became a bit more secularized, it was like professors, for example, older people I met at school, an employer, vice president there, and then later it was various characters I met like within the atheist community, which I spent about 4 or 5 years in. And they learned different things about going from faith to non-belief that I was kind of going through. And then kind of showing up on the right. And a lot of my clients sort of became semi-mentors as I was writing their stories and
Mm-hmm.
their experiences down. It became sort of a mutual mentorship. You tell me your stories and wisdom and experiences, and I'll write your book about them.
Yeah.
Almost. It sort of became.
Yeah. What was your turn back to religion? What instigated that?
Yes, so after as I sort of left the evangelical conservative space in my early 20s and I moved leftward, I began identifying as an atheist at the time. And those two things tend to go together, right? And then I realized right around the birth of my first son, my
Hmm.
first child, I realized I'm surrounded by people who hate their lives. Very much like the atheist, activist, and secularist, agnostic kind of free thinker, free thought community, both online and in person all around Ohio. I noticed that I was the only one who had a kid on the way. Nobody else was having kids. Many of them were single guys. Many of them were also divorced, and all of them were unhappy and generally pessimistic. And like, let's talk about how the God of the Bible sucks was every conversation. And just generally not a positive experience. And I thought, well, even if I think these people are right, I don't want my kids growing up thinking any of these things. These are not productive. I see
Mm.
how your lives are turning out. I don't want my kids around this, you know. And then realizing, having worked with at that time conservative Christian clients, these people are way better as human beings than the liberal secular atheists in terms of aspiration. Well, gosh, even if they're wrong, they're right. Is what I kind of came to accept 2018 or so.
Hmm. Hmm. But it didn't stop there. It didn't
No,
stop
it
at
did not
just
stop
looking at
there.
the exterior lives of people. What was the interior journey for you like?
Of the lives that I observed of others.
No, of accepting religion as formally good, but then you start to practice a religion, it starts to impinge upon your psyche. I assume belief starts
Yes,
to.
yes. I wrote a piece about this last summer or the summer before that, where I was at a right around this time, right before first child was born. Fatherhood does change a man because you begin thinking about what's good for me, and then you begin thinking about what's good for the future. When my son is my age, what will the world be?
Hmm,
Can I affect that? Can I affect him? These are the questions you begin asking. You sort of grow up out of reactionary,
hmm.
let's say, vengeance or that's not fair, these sorts of concerns, and you begin to think about the future. That's why it's like the growing up of what's in the best interest of the children is the set of questions to be asking as a body politic, let's say.
Hmm. Hmm.
But it was around that time, right before he was born, I was at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And I was in the Hall of Human Origins, and nearby is this case of what are alleged to be some of the oldest human-made objects ever. That they're so old that it's not exactly clear if Homo sapiens made them or if it was an ancestor of Homo sapiens or cousin species, let's say, whatever. And for the sake of argument, we'll assume that that's close enough to being true. Okay, the human origins and whatnot. Okay, the different human species and subspecies. Okay. And I noticed that there were three types of artifacts and findings and trinkets. There were tools, very primitive like hammer or nail or drill or cutting pieces or piercing implements that, oh, this is 300,000 years old. This is 180,000 years old. This fish hook made out of mammoth bone or mammoth tusk is 200,000 years old from Russia or something like that. Okay. So we have tools and then we have treasures which are like meaningful decoration or jewelry or proto jewelry or possibly some kind of a bartering currency or something like that. That is archaeologists and paleontologists believe to be some sort of treasures of some sort that had tangible and or intangible value to the early humans. Oh, this is 280,000 years old, and these look like earrings made of gold from 90,000 years ago or whatever. And then the last one were talismans that were small figurettes or figurines or what looked like maybe little icons of various gods, goddesses, spirits, some sort of faith-based object that explained the metaphysical or was meant to embody the metaphysical and the transcendent and the spiritual in an object, an idol of some sort or something like that. And so as I'm standing there contemplating myself as I'm this is my ancestry and now it's my turn to beget my own future ancestor for his
Hmm.
descendants. This is where my mind's at that time. I'm standing in front of this case realizing what it means to be human as in separate from animal. Consciousness is tools, talismans, and treasure. And therefore, finding value in the rare and in the difficult to make, finding value in manipulating the physical world to our benefit, and finding value in faith and belief in the transcendent supernatural world. That is what it means to be human, and it always has been. And it was right around that moment I realized I couldn't call myself an atheist anymore.
Hmm.
Standing there in that museum in New York City. Like, who am I to go against my nature as a human being and say, I know that everyone who believes in this stuff is wrong?
Hmm.
So then I went, okay, well, all right, maybe I'm not an atheist anymore, but I don't know if I believe this stuff. And I'm still a bit of a skeptic at heart, but I do some of these
Hmm.
things, and I go and I observe and watch the mass from the back with one or more of my kids, and I'll participate to an extent. And I'm not baptized in that faith. I was baptized as an evangelical twice for good measure,
Hmm.
as one
Yeah.
does in that faith tradition.
Yeah.
Um, I believe some things and I think some things, but I'm not so faithful, let's say, that I can say, I know these things. Like, I
Yeah.
can't say that I know that Mary is a perpetual virgin. I can't say that I know that. I can't
Yeah.
say that I know that Jesus is sitting at the right hand of the Father. To speak of some religious doctrines and teachings, I
Yeah.
can't say I know that. I could say maybe I suspect or I would consider that, these sorts of things, but up close to statements of faith, I'm not quite there yet. If I
Hmm.
ever will be, but being straightforward about it, that's what I'll say.
If you're able to answer this question, because I know ghostwriting sometimes is an anonymous activity, what was one of the books that really stretched you? Stretched your mind, your heart, even just really stretched.
Is it okay if this is the last question?
Yeah, we can wrap
Okay.
it up.
Okay. Yeah. I gotta pick up my kids here in a moment. I wrote it was in like within a 6 month period. I had three clients, all business subjects, by the way, but all three of them were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons. I didn't know anything at all about that religion. And then having them and being introduced to that worldview, the belief system, it may be incorrect and invalid, but golly, this thing works. This
Hmm.
thing works to create thriving families. Now, it's a tribe, and they are a tribal people, and they have been for about 200 years now. But wow, this works. And I have several Latter-day Saint friends now, and I highly respect them and their religion. And they have what are considered some zany ideas that even they would admit to. But they have like a science fiction, space Jesus, as they would say. I would say it's a Christianity. It's very different from others.
Hmm.
But that was quite a stretch of growing up evangelical and thinking that I knew all the things. And then
Hmm.
in the span of 6 months, having three clients who are, and they injected that, infused that faith into their writing. So ghostwriting from that perspective, as if it was true, that was fascinating.
Wow, wow. So, what's coming up for you, and where can people find your work?
My website is lisecghostwriting.com, and then I am on X, formerly Twitter, at Joshua Lisec. I'm working on two fun co-authorship projects right now, one in the health and wellness space, and then
Hmm?
one in the politics and current events space. Those are both expected to release in summer 2026.
Pretty spicy stuff,
Oh yeah, the best.
okay, good, good. Joshua, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with me. I learned a lot and just really enjoyed your company.
It's my pleasure, Benjamin. Thank you.
Excellent.
You take care.
Yeah, you too. Have a good day.
Sure thing. Bye bye.